Have you ever wondered, if an entire room turned its back on one person, would you have the courage to stand up all alone? In 1,875 inches, the border town of Red Hollow, Wyoming Territory, there was an auction that no one wants to remember. Not because it was noisy or bloody, but because its silence was more cruel than any insult. A woman stood there, Evelyn Crow, thin, quiet, not pleading. No one bid. No one wanted her. And then from the dark corner of the saloon, a man emerged. Thomas Caldwell, a widowed, debt-ridden cowboy, a lifetime of failure. In his pocket were only $2, all he had. Not to be a hero. Not to save anyone. Just to keep his back on them. If it were you, would you keep those $2 for yourself, or use them to stand with a person the whole world has just abandoned? This story isn't about love at first sight. It's about dignity, about small choices in a big moment, and about how sometimes what saves a person isn't a miracle, but a kind decision made at the right time. If you've ever felt undervalued, if you've ever been faced with the choice between playing it safe and preserving your integrity, then this story is for you. Stay with us. And if heartwarming, slow-paced, and profound stories like this resonate with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to continue the journey of the cowboy paid $2 for the girl no one wanted and found. His only hope. In 1874, the town of Dry Creek in Montana was just a faint ink stain on a railroad map. It nestled between arid prairies and low hills eroded by harsh winters. There, people didn't ask each other if they were happy, they only asked how long they could survive. That afternoon, a north wind carried the smell of dry earth and animal dung. The Iron Mule pub lit up earlier than usual. The wooden door creaked each time it opened, as if it too were weary of witnessing so many inappropriate things happening under this roof. The bride auction took place quietly, but not secretly. Everyone in Dry Creek knew about it. It was called by various names: the solution, the deal, or simply the norm. When land was abundant and women were scarce, dignity sometimes became a luxury. The air in the bar was thick with the smell of chewing tobacco, cheap whiskey, and men's sweat. Worn-out jackets hung loosely on the backs of chairs. Hoarse laughter erupted and then died down like a straw fire, burning quickly but not providing enough warmth. Some were already drunk before the auction began, not because they needed to drink, but because drunkenness helped them forget the vague sense of shame lurking somewhere within them. The coordinator stood on a low wooden platform, his voice even like reading a list of goods. Each woman was called by name. A few prices were quickly quoted, accompanied by rough but pragmatic remarks. Still healthy. Knows how to cook. Not too old. No one called it cruel. They called it survival. Margaret Hale remained. She stood at the far end of the room, near the wall where the oil lamp's light couldn't reach. Margaret was thinner than her gray dress suggested. Her hands were clasped tightly together, her knuckles white. Her dark brown hair was neatly tied up, not a single stray strand out of place, as if discipline were the last thing she held on to. She didn't cry, nor did she bow her head. Margaret's eyes stared straight ahead, but she wasn't searching for anyone. There was no pleading, no resentment in her gaze, only a profound weariness that left her powerless to resist. She had long since crossed the line of hope, and now she stood there awaiting the inevitable. A man at a table near the door cleared his throat as if about to say something, then stopped. Another man chuckled a laugh that wasn't malicious but empty. More wine was poured. A coin rolled across the table, then stopped. No one has made an offer. Silence descended upon the room, heavier than the laughter that had just echoed. It wasn't respect. It was avoidance. As if everyone saw Margaret but at the same time pretended she didn't exist. When no one bid, silence became crueler than laughter. Margaret felt it acutely. The humiliation didn't come from a specific insult, but from being collectively ignored by everyone in the room. In that moment, she was no longer the person standing there. She became a void that everyone chose not to fill. In towns like Dry Creek, people were once accustomed to being treated as tools. The elderly vividly remember a time when labor determined survival. Older audiences, those who experienced war, crisis, and unemployment, will recognize that feeling immediately when you are no longer asked who you are but only considered whether you are still useful. Margaret breathed slowly. Each breath was an effort to keep herself standing. She told herself that if she had to leave this pub alone, she would walk with her back straight. Dignity for her was not something given by others. It was something to be held onto even when no one was watching. Outside, the wind was blowing harder, rattling the windows. Another day was drawing to a close, and Dry Creek was preparing for an evening like any other, quiet, harsh, and offering no promise of anything good. But sometimes it is precisely in those moments when you seem to have hit rock bottom that something very small begins to shift. Not noisy, not heroic. Just the quiet choice of another person who is all too familiar with failure and never thought they could rise again. And then amidst that cruel silence there is a man who doesn't smile, doesn't clear his throat. He silently reaches into his old coat pocket as if searching for the last thing he dares to bet on life. Thomas Caldwell sat at a table against the west wall of the Red Hollow pub where the oil lamp never provided enough light. He chose that spot not to avoid anyone, but because he was accustomed to not needing to be seen. At 47, Thomas understood that much of his life had been spent in such secluded corners where one was unnoticed but also not expected. His old felt hat lay face down on his knees. The brim was so worn it had lost its original shape. The coat he wore, once dark brown, had faded to ash gray, permeated with the smell of sun, wind, and the cowshed. His boots were stained with dried mud, the leather cracked like the soil around Caldwell Farm after many consecutive droughts. Thomas didn't drink that night. Not because he was more virtuous than anyone else in the room, but because alcohol brought back too many memories. Memories of his wife who had died during a winter longer than usual. Memories of his unborn child. Memories of the years when he believed that if he worked hard enough the land wouldn't betray him. He sat still, listening to the auction unfold, like listening to a wind blowing across a harvested field, knowing it would pass yet still feeling cold. When the last name was called, Thomas looked up. Evelyn Crow stood there. He didn't know much about her. Only that she had arrived in Red Hollow a few months earlier, traveling with a convoy of wagons, and then stayed. People said she was unlucky. In towns like this, that was the mildest way to describe a life that had been twisted too soon. Thomas saw how she stood, back straight, hands clenched, no bowing, no pleading. It was the stance of someone accustomed to rejection but who had yet to allow herself to fall. He recognized it instantly, because he had stood like that for years. When no one bid, Thomas felt a slight constriction in his chest. Not shock, not anger, just an old familiar sadness, the sadness of witnessing human beings being reduced to objects then dismissed as worthless. He bowed his head and put his hands in his coat pockets. 2 silver coins. They had been sitting there since morning. Thomas had counted them at least 3 times that day. That was all the cash he had. 2 coins for flour, salt, and perhaps enough for a roll of wire to patch the fence. 2 coins to buy another week or less before the bank started sending more insistent debt notices. His fingers touched the cold silver coin. In that moment, Thomas thought of the farm, the empty barn, the loan that was about to come due, all the times he had chosen the safe option and still lost. He didn't get up right away. Thomas wasn't the attention-seeking type. He'd never shouted in his life except when calling cattle in the fields. The men in the tavern were used to yelling, laughing loudly, and haggling in hoarse, alcohol-tinged voices. Thomas didn't belong in that world. He only moved slightly forward. His voice wasn't loud, nor was it shaky. $2. Nobody laughed. No one applauded. The moderator blinked as if unsure of what he had just heard. A few heads turned, not out of admiration but surprise. $2 wasn't a sum that commanded admiration. It was just enough to silence the room once more. Thomas stood up at that moment. He didn't look at Evelyn immediately. He stared straight at the wooden platform as if this were just a transaction to be completed. But in his heart something had just been placed on the table, not money but a choice. He didn't think he was doing something noble. He didn't think he was saving anyone. He wasn't even sure he was doing the right thing. Thomas only knew that if he remained still, he would carry the image of that woman with him for the rest of his life, as a reminder that there was a time when he could have gotten up, but he didn't. Evelyn turned to look at him. Their eyes met for a very brief moment. There was no romance, no promises, just a silent realization between 2 people who had become all too familiar with life's constant pressure. Thomas nodded slightly, not as a greeting, just a signal, "I see you." When the auction ended, the room became noisy again. Wine continued to be poured. Laughter rang out. Life at Red Hollow continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Only Thomas knew that from that moment, everything had changed, not dramatically, not spectacularly, but never again. He stepped outside first. The night wind was colder than he expected. Darkness fell very quickly in this territory. Thomas pulled up his collar and waited. He didn't know what he was waiting for or who, only that leaving now would be another act of cowardice. When Evelyn came out, she stopped a few steps away from him. No one said anything for a moment. Finally, Thomas spoke slowly, as he always spoke to the land and the livestock. "I'm not well off." Evelyn nodded. "I know. I owe the bank money. I guess so. I promise nothing more than a home. And respect." She looked at him longer than before. Then she whispered, "That's enough to begin." Thomas exhaled. Not relief, not joy, just a little less burdensome. Two strangers stood under the vast Wyoming sky, without vows, without dreams. Only two destinies weary of defeat and who had just agreed to try one more time. And it was from that ordinary moment that a marriage, one that promised no love but forced them to learn to live together, began to take shape. A silent agreement between two people who had nothing left to squander but their last shred of self-respect. The following morning, as the marriage certificates were placed on the old wooden desk of the town office, both Thomas and Evelyn understood that what they were signing wasn't love but a commitment to coexistence in a world that had never been lenient with the weak. The Red Hollow town office was located at the end of the main dirt road next to the grain silo. It was a small, low-roofed wooden house with narrow windows built not to welcome anyone but to process paperwork for those who had no other choice. That morning, sunlight streamed through the frosted glass, casting thin streaks of light on the wooden desk, worn and dented by time and the elbows of people. Evelyn Crow sat upright in her backless chair. Her dress was a pale gray, clean but worn. Her hands rested before her fingers intertwined, trembling slightly, not from fear but because she understood the meaning of each word about to be written. Thomas Caldwell sat opposite him. He removed his hat and placed it neatly on his knees. It was a rare gesture he maintained whenever he entered a space requiring respect. His face was austere, his beard unshaven, his eyes calm but deep, the eyes of someone who had carefully considered their options before crossing a threshold from which there was no turning back. The secretary pushed the marriage certificate toward Evelyn first. "Please sign," he said, his voice even and emotionless. To him, it was just another line in the register, another stamp to be affixed. Evelyn held the pen. Her hands trembled more noticeably now, not because the signature was difficult to write, but because she had once lived a different life. A life where writing was used for record-keeping, letter-writing, and calculations. She had once been an educated woman with a respected position and a name that didn't need to be tied to any man. She inhaled slowly. Then, write. Evelyn's handwriting was beautiful and neat, slightly slanted and as regular as train tracks. The secretary glanced at it, pausing for a moment. In towns like Red Hollow, such handwriting was rare, the handwriting of someone who had been carefully educated, who had lived in a different order. Thomas saw it all. He said nothing. But in his heart, his respect for Evelyn didn't begin at the auction, but at that moment, the moment she signed her name without letting anyone steal what little dignity she had left. It was Thomas's turn. He signed quickly. His handwriting was messy, large, and heavy. It was the handwriting of someone who used their hand more than paper. There was nothing to be proud of, but he didn't hide it either. When the formalities were almost complete, Thomas stood up first. He didn't want Evelyn to hear these things in a hurry or with a misunderstanding. He turned to her, his voice low, slow, and unwavering. "I want to make one thing clear." Evelyn looked up, her eyes wary but not defensive. "I'm not buying a servant," Thomas continued, "and I'm not going to lock you in any cage." The words weren't loud. They weren't eloquent. But they fell into that small room with the weight of a vow, not a vow of love, but a vow of respect. Evelyn gazed at him for a long time. In her eyes, something softened like a thin layer of ice cracking after a long winter. She nodded. Then she said softly, "We can begin," as people standing on the same side. Thomas didn't answer, but he understood. Their marriage had no flowers, no wedding veil, no blessings. It was sealed amidst the smell of old wood and dust under the cold Wyoming sun, like most other survival agreements on this frontier. As they left the office, they walked side by side but didn't touch. That distance wasn't a sign of distance, but rather a necessary caution between two people who had been hurt in different ways. Evelyn didn't ask about the farm. Thomas didn't ask about the past. There are stories that don't need to be told right away, or perhaps don't need to be told at all. When they reached Thomas's old carriage, he stopped and opened the door for her. "The road home isn't short," he said. And it's not easy. Evelyn got into the car. I'm used to things not being easy. The road out of Red Hollow was bumpy, full of potholes and gravel. The wheels creaked like the newly signed marriage itself, fragile yet still rolling. On either side, the prairie stretched out yellowed after the dry summer. The space was so vast that it made one feel small, but also large enough to start over if they dared. Thomas gripped the reins firmly. He didn't turn to look at Evelyn, but her presence made the carriage feel less empty than usual. Not warm. Just someone was there. Evelyn sat still, gazing at the horizon. She wasn't daydreaming. She knew full well that life ahead would be one of hard work, hardship, and challenges. But unlike before this time, she wasn't being pushed. She had walked into it of her own accord. This marriage didn't promise love. Neither of them dared to think about it. But it carried a silent commitment to coexist without hurting each other again. And in a land where people often survive by trampling over one another, such an agreement, however fragile, is a rare occurrence. The carriage continued its westward journey to Caldwell Farm, where it awaited old, indebted, and on the verge of collapse. Evelyn watched the road ahead, strangely calm. She didn't know if she would find happiness there, but she knew one thing for sure: this time she wouldn't be walking into the darkness alone. As the sun began to sink behind the barren hills, the silhouette of Caldwell's log cabin emerged in the twilight, and both Thomas and Evelyn understood that this marriage without a promise was about to face a test greater than any piece of paper the dying land before their eyes. Caldwell Farm came into view in the late afternoon, when the sun had set so low that the light was no longer strong enough to conceal anything. The wooden house leaned slightly to the left, like an old man standing too long in the wind. The pine plank roof was warped, a few planks askew, revealing gaps through which winter would sneak in unannounced. The front door creaked when Thomas pushed it open, a sound so familiar he no longer noticed it, like the dull ache in his back each morning. Evelyn stepped down from the carriage slowly. She stood still for a few seconds, not out of fatigue but to observe. The space here was much larger than Red Hollow, but also more empty. There were no human voices, no wheel sounds, only the wind and the smell of dry earth. She clearly sensed the silence of a place that once had a rhythm of life and was slowly losing it. The cowshed was not far from the house. The door hung askew, one hinge broken. Inside, space outnumbered life. There were only 39 cows, so thin their ribs were visible beneath their sun-tanned skin. They stood scattered listlessly, chewing dry grass, their eyes dull with fatigue rather than illness. Thomas stood beside Evelyn, saying nothing. He had seen this scene every day for years. But today, standing next to someone else, he suddenly saw it more starkly, as if this land had finally been forced to admit that it was losing. "They used to be more," he said, his voice low, almost audible only to the wind. "Doubled." Evelyn nodded. She didn't ask why. She knew the answer. Droughts don't need a reason. Neither do banks. They entered the house. Inside was a single room, serving as both kitchen, dining room, and Thomas's sleeping quarters since his wife's death. A wooden table sat by the window, its surface covered in old knife cuts and burn marks. A chair was missing its backrest. The cast-iron stove was cold, the old ashes still uncleaned. Evelyn placed her small bag in the corner of the room. She didn't ask where she would sleep. In this land, that question wasn't as important as what they would eat tomorrow. Thomas hung his hat on a nail in the wall. He stood with his back to the wall for a long time, as if looking at something only he could see. "The bank gave me 4 months," he said finally. "Then they'll come." The words fell into the room like a heavy stone. No drama, no anger, just the truth, naked and unnegotiable. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She went to the window and looked out at the field behind the house. The cracked earth, the low-lying grass, a yellowish-gray color, stretched to the horizon. A lifetime could pass on such a piece of land and could also vanish from it without a trace. A lifetime of work. Thomas continued, his voice hoarser, slipping through the fingers. He didn't look at Evelyn when he said that. He looked at his hands. Hands that had tilled the land, mended fences, carried calves, and buried loved ones. Those hands now trembled slightly, not from weakness but from exhaustion. Evelyn turned around. She looked at Thomas, as if he were a man standing before the grave of his own life. Not everyone would have the courage to stand there without turning and running away. "He's not lazy," she said. "And he's not stupid." Thomas gave a wry smile. "The bank doesn't care about that. But I do." The words weren't loud. But they created a different kind of silence, not heavy but thoughtful. Evening arrived quickly. Evelyn lit the fire. The flames blazed weakly, then grew stronger. The orange light illuminated the wooden walls, making the house a little less cold. They ate a simple dinner, stale bread, thin soup. No one complained. At their age, silence during meals was no longer something to be feared. After the meal, Thomas took a bundle of papers bound together with string from his drawer, debt ledgers, bills, promissory notes. He placed them on the table as if he were laying down his entire life there. Evelyn looked. She didn't touch it right away. She understood that this land wasn't just dying from drought or debt. It was dying from prolonged solitude, a man struggling alone for so long that he could no longer see any other way than to try one more day. Thomas sat down and sighed. "I don't expect you to fix anything," he said. "I just wanted you to know." Evelyn nodded. "I need to know if I want to stay." That night the wind blew harder. The wooden house creaked like an old ship at sea. Evelyn lay on the small bed in the corner of the room listening to the strange sounds. She didn't fall asleep right away. She thought of all the people who had lived and died on this land, believing that with persistence the land would reward them. Perhaps they were right for a time. But time owes no one anything. At the other end of the room, Thomas lay facing the wall. He stared into the darkness. He wasn't afraid of losing the land. He was afraid that everything he had ever done, ever believed, had ultimately been a lifelong mistake. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the window, weak but persistent. Evelyn woke up early. She went outside, walked along the barn, observing each cow. She didn't know much about animal husbandry, but she knew how to read data, and she knew that people often give up not because they lack strength, but because they lack a different perspective. Thomas stood on the porch, watching her disappear. He didn't know that in that moment something very small was changing, not the land itself, but the way they stood together on it. This land may be dying, but it hasn't been completely abandoned. And as Evelyn returned to the porch, carrying with her in her mind numbers and unspoken possibilities, Thomas began to realize that perhaps this land didn't need a miracle, but rather someone who knew how to count what still remained. Tuesday morning at Caldwell Farm began like any other: wind, dust, and an inexplicable silence. Thomas woke up before sunrise, a habit he'd maintained for years. He put on his coat, stepped out onto the porch, and gazed at the land still covered in a thin layer of dew. The lean cows stood scattered about, their shadows stretching long across the dry, cracked earth. When he went back inside, Evelyn was already awake. She was sitting at the wooden table, her hands resting on the stack of promissory notes and ledgers that Thomas had left behind the night before. She wasn't flipping through them haphazardly. She just placed her hands on them as if asking permission for something very private. Thomas stopped. He wasn't used to other people touching those numbers. To him, they weren't just paper and ink, they were proof of failure, of poor choices, of a lifetime of work yet still trapped in the grip of the bank. Evelyn looked up when she heard footsteps. "If you don't mind," she said slowly, "I'd like to take a closer look." Thomas stood still for a few seconds. Then he nodded. "Just take a look." There was no private room to retreat to. Evelyn spread the ledgers out on the table in the soft morning light. She read very slowly, not because they were difficult to understand, but because she wanted to see the whole story behind the numbers. Thomas sat opposite her, his hands clasped together. He felt strange, as if he were being scrutinized. But Evelyn's gaze held no judgment. It held a focus, something he rarely received. She asked a few questions. "Not many. Not in a rush. What was the price of grass last season? What about the cost of medicine for the cows? What is the interest rate on this loan?" Thomas answered each question one by one. He realized that he remembered everything very clearly, every expense. Every time he sold cattle, every drought season. Nothing was vague in his memory, it was just that no one had ever told him that these things were worth sorting out. After nearly an hour, Evelyn looked up. "He's not stupid," she said, her voice calm. "He just hasn't been taught how to manage." Thomas chuckled softly, a laugh that was neither sarcastic nor bitter. Just one of surprise. The bank never said that. They have no reason to say anything. Evelyn smiled softly, very gently. Then she told her story. Her father used to be an accountant for a railroad in Street Louis. He wasn't rich, but he was careful. He taught her how to keep records from a young age, not to get rich, but to avoid being cheated. He said numbers don't betray. People do. Evelyn grew up surrounded by spreadsheets, bills, and train schedules. She once believed her life would be tied to numbers until everything fell apart in a way no ledger could ever record. Thomas listened. He didn't interrupt. He realized that this was the first time since his wife's death he had truly heard someone else talk about themselves without feeling like he was a burden to anyone. Evelyn returned to her books. "The problem isn't that he's doing something wrong," she said. "The problem is that he's selling in the wrong place, buying at the wrong time, and borrowing under unfavorable terms." Thomas leaned forward. "Is there another way?" he asked, neither hopeful nor giving up. Evelyn thought for a moment. She didn't answer immediately. She didn't want to say anything uncertain. Maybe she said finally, "But it won't be easy, and it won't be quick." Thomas nodded. He was used to things not being easy, but for the first time in many years he felt he no longer had to guess. They worked together all morning. Evelyn wrote down the figures outlining the possibilities, small, fragile, but real. Thomas provided the details. He realized that his memory, which he had once thought useless, was actually an asset. At lunchtime they ate quickly. No one mentioned being tired. No one mentioned the time. In the afternoon Evelyn went to the barn. She counted them, not missing a single one. She recorded the condition of each one, not with her experience as a cowherd, but with the carefulness she had learned from her father. Thomas stood beside her, answering her questions. He didn't feel like he was being tested. He felt like he was being trusted. As the sun began to set, they returned to the porch. The wind was gentler than the day before. Evelyn closed her notebook. "He has done everything he knows how," she said. "Now we will do things he has never been taught." Thomas looked at her. Not as he would look at a wife, not as he would look at a benefactor, but as he would look at a fellow traveler. For the first time his intelligence was recognized not with pity but with respect. And for the first time Evelyn's intelligence was not considered superfluous in a world accustomed to measuring value by physical strength. That evening, Thomas took out a new piece of paper. "Tomorrow," he said, "you can show me how to continue." Evelyn nodded. "Out there, the prairie remains barren. The bank continues to count the days. But inside that leaning wooden house, something very important has been put back in its place. People don't just live by their strength, but by how they understand and appreciate each other." And as the numbers began to reveal the true value of the Caldwell land, Thomas and Evelyn were unaware that someone else in the area was also counting not to save the land but to seize it. In Red Hollow it is said that three things are unavoidable: winter drought and Henry Blackwell. He didn't need to show up often. Just the mention of his name in the pub, in the bank, or in a half-joking remark among the cowherds was enough to silence the room. Blackwell didn't shout. He didn't need to. His power lay in the fact that others knew he could wait, and while they waited, everything would gradually fall into his hands. Henry Blackwell was the only banker in Red Hollow. He also owned the largest cattle ranch in the area, stretching along Clear Fork Creek, a scarce water source that hadn't completely dried up after several consecutive droughts. It was uncertain how wealthy he was, but it was known that when Blackwell wanted a piece of land, it would eventually fall into his hands through paperwork, debt, or the weariness of others. Thomas Caldwell met Blackwell on a windy morning. He went into town to pay a small interest payment, the meager sum Evelyn had helped him make from selling some of his leanest cows. Thomas didn't expect it to change anything, but he believed that standing tall in front of the bank was better than sitting with his head bowed at home. Evelyn went along. She didn't go inside with him. She stood across the street in front of the grocery store, watching the sparse flow of people. She knew there were conversations that didn't need a third person. But she also knew that her presence, however silent, was a reminder Thomas wasn't alone anymore. Inside the bank, the smell of old paper and ink mingled with the scent of polished wood. Henry Blackwell sat behind a large desk, his back against a high chair. He wore a dark suit jacket, neatly buttoned, his beard trimmed. It was the look of a man always prepared for any situation because he was rarely caught off guard. "Caldwell," Blackwell said, his voice low and unhurried. "It's been a long time." Thomas nodded. "I've come to pay the interest." Blackwell took the bag of money, weighing it in his hands, not to count but to feel it. He set it down on the table and opened his ledger. "He still has 4 months, Blackwell said, "but he knows that's just a formality." Thomas did not answer. Blackwell looked up, his eyes sharp but not angry. "I heard you just got married." Thomas nodded again. "A clever woman," Blackwell said, as if commenting on a fine horse. "Rare in this area." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. Not because of the words, but because of the way they were said. Blackwell knew, and Blackwell was considering it. "I want to propose a solution," Blackwell continued, his voice gentle. "You sell me the land to the south where there's a stream during the dry season. I'll forgive the debt. You keep the house and a few cows. You live in peace." Thomas looked straight at him. "That's the best piece of land I own." Blackwell shrugged. "That's why." The silence lasted a long time. Thomas thought of Evelyn. He thought of the numbers. He thought of the mornings, when they had begun to believe that something could be turned around. He also thought of that piece of land where his wife used to grow potatoes, where he used to believe his children would grow up. "I'm not ready," Thomas said. Blackwell smiled. Not a malicious smile. It was the smile of someone who had seen this answer many times before. "Pride doesn't keep cattle alive," he said, his voice even. "Honor doesn't feed cattle." Thomas stood up. "I'll take care of it myself," he said. Blackwell nodded, as if confirming something he already knew. "The door is always open," he said. For 4 months, Thomas went outside. The wind was blowing strongly. Evelyn saw his face before he could say anything. She didn't ask. She just walked closer. "He wants to buy the land," Thomas said after a pause. "The part with water." Evelyn nodded. "I guess so." He said, "Honor can't feed a cow." Evelyn looked towards the bank. "But without honor, what will people feed?" They said nothing more. No need. On the way back to the ranch, Thomas thought about Blackwell not as a personal enemy, but as part of a system that had existed far too long. Blackwell didn't need guns. He only needed time, and the despair of others. That evening, Thomas sat on the porch watching the shadows fall over the prairie. Evelyn brought him 2 glasses of water. No alcohol. They sat next to each other, close enough to feel each other's warmth, yet far enough to respect each other. "He wasn't wrong," Thomas said finally. "Honor doesn't feed cows." Evelyn was silent for a moment. Then she replied, "But it feeds people." Thomas turned to look at her. "In Red Hollow, Henry Blackwell owns the bank, the cattle ranch, and much of the town's fear. But he doesn't own the ultimate choice of each individual unless they hand it over themselves." And this time, Thomas Caldwell wasn't ready to do it. It was from that cold dialogue, when power revealed its true face, that Evelyn began to understand that to keep this land they would have to do something. No one in Red Hollow dared to do a plan, not based on pity but on calculated courage. The very end. That night the wind wasn't as strong as on previous nights, but it was persistent, a wind that wouldn't break trees, only keep people awake. Thomas Caldwell sat at the wooden table, an oil lamp between them. The yellowish light fell on the neatly arranged papers Evelyn had laid out, as if they were no longer meaningless numbers but a map leading out of the darkness. Thomas looked at them for a long time. It wasn't that he didn't understand. It was that he understood all too well what Evelyn was about to say, and that frightened him. Evelyn wasn't in a hurry. She poured more water into Thomas's glass before sitting down. She knew that a plan was only valuable if the listener was calm enough to hear it all. "Red Hollow is not the place to sell cattle right now," she said. Thomas frowned. "This is the nearest market. It's also where Henry Blackwell controls the prices." The statement wasn't angry. It was simply a fact put in the right place. Evelyn unfolded another piece of paper. On it were a few lines of notes written in neat and clear handwriting. "Clearwater Junction," she continued. "The new train line will be going through there within the next few weeks." Thomas looked up. Too far. Further than Red Hollow. Evelyn nodded. But far enough to avoid being overcharged. Thomas leaned back in his chair. He exhaled slowly, as if he had just heard something both logical and dangerous. "Taking the cattle that many miles," he said. "They're thin. The road is difficult. If we lose a few—" "If you stay," Evelyn interrupted gently, "you'll lose everything." The atmosphere in the wooden house became quiet. Not heavy, just focused. Thomas looked out the window. Darkness stretched out before him as vast as his own fear. He was used to enduring, used to trying one more day and then another. But this plan wasn't about enduring, it was a calculated gamble. And that frightened him more than failure. "I'm not used to doing things like that," he said. "I know," Evelyn replied. "But you're used to being pushed into a corner." Thomas didn't argue. He remembered Blackwell. He remembered the faint smile. He remembered the words, "Pride doesn't keep cattle alive." "Does Clearwater Junction really have a buyer?" he asked. "Yes," Evelyn said, "and there's more than one." She spoke of the railway line, of traders from the east seeking new sources of cattle, of prices not yet being driven down by a single person. She didn't speak like a hopeful seller. She spoke like someone who had weighed the risks. Thomas listened. Every word Evelyn said didn't lessen his fear, but it gave him something he'd lacked for years, a clear path. "We'll have to go over the pass," he said, "and cross the river. I know. If something happens, we'll face it," Evelyn said, not raising her voice. "We're not relying on luck." Thomas was silent for a long time. He thought about the times he hadn't dared to try, the times he'd sold his cattle hastily just to pay the interest, the times he'd accepted low prices for fear of losing everything. He thought about the land to the south, the land Blackwell wanted to buy. And he thought about what Evelyn had said the day before. "Honor feeds a man." "I'm scared," he said finally. Evelyn nodded. "Me too." That answer surprised Thomas. Not because Evelyn admitted to being afraid, but because she didn't hide it behind a facade of confidence. She didn't need to be stronger than him. She just needed to be there with him in that fear. But this time she continued, "We're afraid because we know what we're doing." Thomas chuckled softly, a brief, unhappy but genuine laugh. They continued discussing until late at night. The route, the timing, whether the weakest oxen would go first or last, the amount of water to carry, resting spots. Evelyn took notes. Thomas offered suggestions. There was no longer any distance between speaker and listener, only two people building a fragile path together. When the oil lamp was almost empty, Thomas stood up. "We'll give it a try," he said. There were no cheers, no hugs, just a decision placed on the table, heavy and real. The next morning, Thomas began his preparations. He adjusted the reins, checked the wheels, counted the oxen. Evelyn helped him sort them, which ones could travel far, which ones needed an extra day's rest. They worked quietly, naturally, in sync. A few neighbors stopped by, looked around, and shook their heads. "Are you crazy?" someone said. "Clearwater Junction is far away." Thomas simply nodded. He offered no explanation. He was used to being wrong. Evelyn stood on the porch watching Thomas work. She didn't see a reckless man. She saw a man who was finally allowed to take the initiative and make his own choices. In the afternoon, Thomas sat down by the cowshed, breathing heavily. Evelyn brought him water. "You can stop," she said, "if you change your mind." Thomas shook his head. "No, this time. I want to know what would have happened if I hadn't turned my back." Evelyn said nothing more. She understood that there are moments in life when continuing doesn't come from hope, but from a newly awakened sense of self-respect. That night, Thomas didn't sleep much. He lay listening to the cows breathing outside, listening to the wind, listening to his own heartbeat. He was afraid, but it was a different kind of fear, the fear of someone stepping out of a decaying shelter. Before dawn, Evelyn got up first. She put on her coat and went outside. She looked toward Clearwater Junction, a place that had never been her destination, but perhaps where they would begin to preserve all that remained. When Thomas walked out, she turned around. "We're not relying on luck," she said. "We're going because we've already counted." Thomas nodded. And in that moment, amidst the arid landscape of Wyoming, a plan no one in Red Hollow dared attempt officially began. Not with gunfire, not with a challenge, but with the quiet courage of two people who chose to believe in each other's intelligence. But as they began preparing for this unprecedented journey, neither Thomas nor Evelyn knew that this plan would not only test the endurance of the cattle, but would also force them to step out of their paperwork roles and become true companions toiling with their own sweat and blood. On the first morning they began preparing for their journey to Clearwater Junction, the weather was neither sunny nor rainy. It was the familiar in-between weather of Wyoming, neither promising nor threatening, just silently testing human patience. Thomas got up very early. He was used to working alone, used to having all the decisions rest on his shoulders. But that morning when he opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, Evelyn was standing there. She wore Thomas's old coat, too big for her, the sleeves neatly rolled up. Her hair was tied back. No makeup, nothing about her appearance as someone married. Just someone who had chosen to stay and started doing her part. "He taught me how to ride a horse," Evelyn said. Thomas paused for a moment. He looked at her, then at the mare standing near the fence, an old horse, not beautiful but as resilient as himself. "It's not easy," he said. "I'm not looking for the easy way," Evelyn replied. Thomas said nothing more. He led the horse out to the open field behind the house. Evelyn watched as he saddled it and adjusted the reins. He did it more slowly than usual, not out of suspicion, but because he wanted her to see each movement clearly. The first time Evelyn climbed into the saddle, she nearly fell. Thomas held the reins firmly, not pulling hard, not shouting. Evelyn gasped for breath, her hands trembling, but she didn't let go. "Don't resist it," Thomas said. "Go with it." Evelyn nodded. The second time she sat more steadily. The third time the horse began to walk slowly. Not beautiful, not graceful, but enough. As Evelyn dismounted, her legs trembled slightly. She smiled, not a smile of joy, but a smile of knowing she had just crossed a small boundary. "That's good," Thomas said. "Not much praise, but enough." The following days passed in a steady rhythm of work. Evelyn didn't stand idly by. She dug irrigation ditches, each stroke heavier than she imagined. The soil was dry and hard, not easily yielded. With each swing, her wrists went numb. Her hands blistered, then the skin tore. Blood was oozing out. Evelyn wrapped the cloth around herself and continued. Thomas saw it. He didn't stop it. Not because he was heartless, but because he understood the feeling. The feeling of physical pain, but inner peace like never before. She learned to mend fences. The wire cut into her skin. Each knot required strength and patience. At first her hands trembled. Then they got used to it. The crisscrossing scratches were like a map of a new land, a land she was entering with her own strength. At lunchtime they ate quickly. There were no long breaks. There was just enough water. But nobody complained. Thomas began to notice something very strange. He no longer had to carry Evelyn. He worked alongside her. One afternoon, Thomas was fixing a wheel. Evelyn handed him the nails. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. She didn't interfere. But when Thomas had trouble with a wooden joint, Evelyn watched, thought for a moment, and then offered to switch places. Thomas complied. "It works." There was no loud acknowledgement. But in Thomas's eyes, something changed, not surprise, but reassurance. That evening, Evelyn washed her hands in a basin of cold water. Her hands were swollen, red, and stinging. Thomas placed a bowl of salt water on the table. "Soak it," he said. Evelyn looked at him, slightly surprised. "I've seen my wife do that," Thomas said, his voice low. When her hands cracked from the cold, Evelyn soaked her hands. She didn't say thank you. It wasn't necessary. In the following days, Evelyn learned more quickly. She wasn't stronger than Thomas, not healthier than the men in the area, but she had something that many had lost the will to do her part without comparing herself to others or boasting. A neighbor stopped by, saw Evelyn digging the ditch, and shook his head. Someone made a casual remark. Thomas didn't reply. Neither did Evelyn. In the evening, as they sat on the porch, they spoke little, but the silence between them was no longer distant. It was like the silence between two people who understood each other's breathing. Evelyn is no longer just a wife on paper, not because she's proving anything, but because she's there every day, every little thing, without giving up. Thomas realized that he was beginning to rely on that presence, not out of weakness, but because he believed. One afternoon, while repairing the fence, Evelyn slipped. A wire cut deep into her palm. She bled more than usual. Thomas ran to her. "Let me," he said. Evelyn shook her head, clenching her teeth in pain. "Wait." She bandaged the wound tightly. Her hands trembled, but she didn't complain. Thomas stood there watching. A strange feeling welled up inside him, not pity, not gratitude. It was respect. He suddenly understood that true value didn't lie in physical strength. It lay in a person's ability to persevere, even when no one was watching. That night, Evelyn slept soundly. Thomas sat at the table looking at the numbers. He saw them more clearly than before, not because they had changed, but because he was no longer looking at them alone. Out there, the road to Clearwater Junction is still long. The cattle are still thin. Blackwell is still waiting. But in that leaning wooden house, one thing had been set in motion. They were no longer two strangers signing a piece of paper. They were two people sharing the same life. And just when they thought that simply continuing to work would be enough, one night in the silent darkness, someone decided to remind them that dirty power doesn't need to be confronted. It just needs to destroy in silence. That night came without warning. The days passed like any other work, silent small tasks following one another. Evelyn worked harder than usual, not to prove anything, but because there are days when one just keeps going to avoid stopping to think. Thomas noticed this, but he didn't stop her. He knew there were fatigues that weren't physical. The sun set slowly behind the hills, leaving a thin, ash-like twilight. The wind was less cold. The cowshed was quieter than usual. Everything seemed so normal that no one thought that night would be any different. After a simple dinner, Evelyn got up to wash the dishes. Her hands trembled slightly. Thomas noticed, but thought it was just fatigue. He cleared the table and brought water out to the porch. When he returned, he heard a dry, scraping sound, like a chair being dragged forcefully. Then there was silence. Thomas walked in quickly. Evelyn lay on the floor, slumped beside the table. Her face was pale. Her eyes were tightly closed. Her hand still clutched the cloth tied around her wrist where an old wound had not yet healed. Evelyn. Thomas called, his voice low but urgent. There was no response. He knelt down and placed his hand on her forehead. Hot. He lifted her head and called out again. He didn't shake her. He didn't panic. Thomas had witnessed human bodies collapse before, and he knew the first thing to do was to remain calm. He carefully lifted her onto the bed, his movements as gentle as if he were placing a fragile object. He covered her with a blanket, fetched some water, and wiped her forehead. Outside, the wind whistled through the wooden walls, carrying a thin, long whistling sound. After a while, Evelyn stirred slightly. She opened her eyes very slowly. Her gaze was hazy, like someone who had just emerged from the bottom of deep water. Don't try to speak, Thomas whispered. Just breathe. Evelyn closed her eyes. A single tear welled up, rolling down her temple without a sob. It was just a sign that something had become overwhelming. She breathed more evenly. Then, without looking at Thomas, she spoke, a hoarse, low voice as if talking to herself. In that room, I'm worth $2. The words fell like a heavy weight into the wooden house. There was no anger in her voice, only the naked truth finally finding its way out. Thomas didn't answer immediately. He sat down on the edge of the bed. He remembered that room very clearly. The smell of alcohol, the laughter, the silence more cruel than any insult. He had carried that memory with him like a stone in his pocket, heavy but familiar. The whole room, Evelyn continued, her eyes still closed, looked at me like I was an object, and decided that I wasn't worth it. She swallowed hard. I thought, maybe they were right. Thomas placed his hand on the edge of the bed, very close but not touching. He understood that there were moments when presence was more important than any hug. And then he said, $2, Evelyn said. I didn't know what to feel. Grateful or ashamed. She opened her eyes and looked at Thomas. Do you know that feeling? When an entire lifetime is encapsulated in a single number. Thomas looked straight back without flinching. Yes, he said. Evelyn blinked. Unexpected. I used to think my whole life was worth less than the cows I raised, Thomas said slowly. I used to watch this land slip through my fingers and think, maybe I'm in the same boat. He took a deep breath. Then he said the words he had been holding back for a long time. That's all I had. And I gave it away voluntarily. Evelyn froze. Thomas wasn't speaking to make excuses. He wasn't speaking to lessen her pain. He was simply placing his truth alongside hers on equal footing. It's not because I think you're only worth $2, he continued, but because I don't want to leave that room feeling like I've turned my back on you. A long silence. Evelyn closed her eyes. Tears flowed more freely, but there was no sobbing. She trembled slightly, like a final door finally opening in a house that had been locked for too long. He didn't buy me, she said very softly. He stopped. Thomas nodded. That night Evelyn fell asleep from exhaustion. Thomas sat by her bedside for a long time. He didn't think he had just done anything significant. He only knew that some wounds don't need medicine, they need a truthful voice heard to the very end. Outside, the moon rose high. Its silvery light bathed the arid prairie, softening everything as if the earth itself were breathing more slowly. Thomas got up and covered Evelyn with the blanket. He looked at her hands, calluses, scratches, cuts, the unassuming marks of labor. He understood that a person's value lies not in how they are valued, but in how they continue to live decently after being valued at their lowest point. As Thomas stepped out onto the porch, the cold night wind jolted him awake. He gazed toward Red Hollow, where the town lights loomed in the distance. He thought of Henry Blackwell, of quiet power, of ways of destruction that didn't require guns. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew that tonight had changed them in ways that could never be reversed. Inside the sloping log cabin, Evelyn breathed evenly. For the first time in a long time, her sleep wasn't haunted by a number. And before dawn could break after that night of turmoil, invisible hands chose to act in the shadows to remind them that the path to preserving dignity would never be left unchecked. That night, Caldwell Farm was enveloped in an eerie silence. It wasn't the pleasant tranquility of a day's work ending, but a tense silence, as if the land and the livestock were holding their breath. The wind blew very gently, not strong enough to rattle the doors, but enough to carry an unnameable sense of unease. Thomas slept fitfully, his dreams coming and going indistinctly. At the other end of the room, Evelyn breathed more evenly than usual, but still not deeply. Her body was too exhausted to have nightmares, and that was what worried Thomas. Around midnight there was a very faint sound. Not a sound loud enough to wake anyone. Not a shattering, not a scream. Just a movement, metal touching wood so light it blended into the sound of the wind. The cowshed was opened. No one could see anyone. There were no figures, no distinct footprints in the darkness. Only the doors, usually carefully closed, were now hanging askew. Only the ropes had been neatly untied, not cut, not broken, as if the person who did it didn't want to make a fuss. The cows panicked silently. A few mooed softly, then ran. Not out of sudden fear, but because instinct told them something was wrong. The morning arrived later than usual. Thomas woke up while it was still gray. He put on his coat and went outside as usual, but even from the porch he knew something was wrong. Not with the eyes, but with the senses of someone who has lived long enough on this land to recognize when order is broken. He walked quickly towards the barn. The door opened. The tie is loose. The gap is too large for my memory. Thomas stood still for a long time, counting in his head. No pen and paper needed. He knew each cow. He knew how they stood. He knew the familiar position of each of those thin, gaunt figures. 6 children. 6 of them are missing. There was no blood. No signs of attack. Nothing resembling an accident. Just a planned disappearance. Evelyn stepped out behind him. She didn't ask any questions. She watched. She counted, too. It's not a stampede, she said softly. Someone opened the cage. Thomas nodded. His jaw tightened. In that moment he wasn't thinking about the value of the 6 cows. He was thinking about the message. We can touch him at any time. No guns needed. No threats required. Just one night. They followed the tracks. The ground was dry and difficult to follow. But the cow tracks led north, then disappeared at an old section of the trail. Thomas knew that section where the ground was firm and left fewer tracks. It wasn't a random choice. Evelyn stood beside him, her hands clasped tightly. Her face was pale, but her eyes showed no panic. She was simply more composed than ever. We don't need to see the culprit's face, she said. I know who wants us to be afraid. Thomas didn't answer. He bent down and picked up the untied cord. The knot was neat, not the work of a clumsy person. Henry Blackwell. The name doesn't need to be said. That morning they didn't eat. Thomas repaired the barn. Evelyn took notes. The loss of 6 cows was not just a numerical loss, it was a test of their morale. The neighbor stopped by, looked at the coop, looked at the empty space, shaken his head. Perhaps he should sell the land, someone said, their voice not malicious. At least he'll keep the house. Thomas did not answer. Evelyn sensed one thing clearly: fear spreads faster than drought. It doesn't need a good reason. It just needs to be sown at the right time. At midday, Thomas sat on a log near the barn, his head bowed low. Evelyn brought him water. What do you think? She asked. Thomas didn't look up. I think he wanted me to understand that our plan had been seen through, and he wants you to stop. Thomas nodded. Do you want to stop? Evelyn asked, her voice strangely calm. Thomas looked up. His eyes were tired but not empty. No, he said, but I'm scared. Evelyn sat down next to him. Very close. No touching. Fear doesn't mean it's wrong, she said. It just means we've encroached on someone's interests. Thomas chuckled softly. I just want to sell the cows somewhere else. For some people, Evelyn said, that's all it takes to be considered a rebel. In the evening they checked on the remaining cattle. They counted each one again. Evelyn was taking more careful notes than before. Each one was now not just property, a silent challenge. Night falls. Thomas wasn't asleep. He sat on the porch, his gun nearby but untouched. He didn't believe in violence. He believed in not running away. Evelyn went out with him. She put on an extra coat. The wind was getting colder. "We're still going to Clearwater Junction," Thomas said, as if confirming it to himself. Evelyn nodded. That's exactly why they did it. They sat still, listening to the night, listening to the sound of cows breathing, listening to the fear that was finding its way in. But this time, fear didn't take over the leaning wooden house. It just stood on the porch waiting, like someone who knows they've sown a seed but isn't sure they'll reap a harvest. Thomas looked toward Red Hollow. He no longer thought of Henry Blackwell as a person. He thought of him as a force, something that existed because others bowed to it. And tonight, despite losing 6 cows, Thomas Caldwell has not bowed his head. But just as the darkness receded after that first act of destruction, Evelyn understood they didn't have much time to hesitate either, leave while they still could or stay, and lose everything in prolonged fear. The morning following the initial act of vandalism came with a heavy silence. There was no further damage, no new signs, but it was precisely this silence that made things suffocating. Thomas Caldwell understood this feeling all too well, the feeling when a force has acted then stepped back far enough to observe how fear will do the rest. He woke up earlier than usual, not because he slept well, but because he couldn't sleep any longer. The barn was still standing there. The remaining cattle were silent, as if they too knew that any movement now had to be done cautiously. Thomas checked the ropes, the barn door, the fence, every little detail. Not to find more traces, but to keep his mind busy. Evelyn stepped out as dawn broke. She put on her coat, carrying a notebook. She didn't say anything immediately. She looked at Thomas, at the barn, at the empty space where the 6 cows used to stand. Finally she spoke. "We don't have much time left." Thomas nodded. He didn't ask why. He knew. They sat down at the old wooden table, the place that had once witnessed desperate numbers and fragile hopes. The oil lamp was not lit. Daylight was enough to see the truth. Evelyn spread out her notebook, not to do calculations, but to lay everything down on the table. "If we stay," she said slowly, "we'll lose more. Maybe not today, but little by little." Thomas looked at the numbers. The 6 cows gone had left a clear gap. No need for much addition or subtraction. "And if we go," Thomas said, "we could lose everything immediately." Evelyn nodded. "Yes, there are no cheap reassurances, no painted veneers of hope. Just 2 possibilities, both painful but different ways. We leave now," Evelyn said, her voice low but firm. "Or we'll lose everything." Slowly. The words hung, suspended in the room, like a clean cut through any lingering hesitation. Thomas leaned back in his chair. He looked up at the ceiling, where tiny cracks ran along the grain of the wood. He had looked at this ceiling for years, on weary nights, on long winters, on days when he believed that just a little more effort would suffice. But now he understands that trying without change is just a way of prolonging failure. "Henry Blackwell wants us to stay," Thomas said. "He wants us to be afraid." Evelyn didn't deny it. "He doesn't need to take the land by force. He just needs to believe he has no other choice." Thomas chuckled softly, a weary laugh. "I've believed that for years." Evelyn looked at him. No pity, no reproach, but not now. A long silence ensued. Outside, the wind blew across the dry fields, carrying fine dust. The prairie didn't care what people chose, but people had to live with their choices. Thomas stood up. He went to the window and looked south towards the part of the land with the water source that Blackwell wanted. He remembered the days of digging the ditch, the times he repaired the fence, the faint hope that the land would respond. If he stayed, he could hold out for a few more months, maybe a year. But the price would be the gradual draining of his spirit, little by little, until he no longer recognized himself. "We're going," Thomas said. Evelyn didn't sigh in relief. She didn't smile. She simply nodded, as if the decision had been long awaited. "While God still permits," he continued. "Don't wait any longer." Evelyn jotted down a few notes. Not a new plan, but the timing of its execution. They began preparing in silence. Not because they were afraid of being overheard, but because there was no need to say much. Everything that needed to be said had already been said. Thomas tightened the reins. He checked the wheels. He selected the oxen strong enough to lead. Evelyn sorted the rest, marking those that needed special attention. They worked as 2 people accustomed to relying on each other, no orders, no unnecessary questions. A neighbor stopped by, saw the commotion, and paused. "Are you really going?" he asked. Thomas nodded. "Yes." The other man shook his head. "It's too dangerous." Thomas didn't argue. Staying is also fine. The answer wasn't raised in a loud voice, but it silenced the other person. In the afternoon, Evelyn sat down to rest on the porch. Thomas offered her some water. They sat next to each other, their shoulders almost touching. "Do you regret it?" Evelyn asked very softly. Thomas thought for a moment. Then he shook his head. "I was scared," he said. "But for the first time, I didn't feel cornered." Evelyn nodded. "Fear, because I'm choosing, not because I'm being chosen for." That night they didn't sleep much, not because of panic, but because each of them was bidding farewell to a part of their past lives, a part that had been tied to this land, to their solitary efforts, to their prolonged endurance. Thomas stood on the porch for a long time. He gazed at the starry sky. Wyoming at night was so vast and deep that it made all personal fears seem small, but it also made the responsibility greater. If he leaves, he might lose the land, lose his house, lose everything he's built. But if he stays, he will lose what he has just regained, self-respect and the ability to choose. Evelyn came out with him. "We're not going to come back as fugitives," she said. "No matter what the outcome." Thomas turned to look at her. There was no longer any hesitation in his eyes. "No," he said. "We're going as we've decided." The night wind blew stronger, but it wasn't cold. It carried the scent of earth and dry grass, the smell of the borderlands, never easy to find, but always honest. Tomorrow morning they will leave Caldwell Farm, not to escape but to reclaim control of their own destiny, even if the price may be high. And it was when that decision was made, caught between fear and courage, that those who had been oppressed in silence began to remember that they were not the only ones who had been forced to bow their heads by Henry Blackwell. They left Caldwell Farm while the morning dew still clung to the grass. The wheels rolled slowly, quietly, as if the road itself understood that haste at this moment would only reveal fear. The cattle went ahead, each step heavy but steady. Thomas held the reins firmly. Evelyn walked beside him, her notebook clutched to her chest, as if holding something fragile yet essential. Out of sight of the leaning wooden house, they met Samuel Ortega. He stood by the old fence at the edge of the field, thin but upright. His gray hair was neatly combed, and an old straw hat covered half of his face, etched with the lines of time. Samuel wasn't the kind of person who frequented town. They said he'd had enough of Red Hollow since the day he had to sell his land, not because he wanted to, but because he had no other choice. Thomas stopped the car. Evelyn stayed put, keeping the cattle from scattering. The wind blew across the field, carrying the scent of dry earth and old grass. "Are you guys going to Clearwater Junction?" Samuel asked, his voice low, not seeking confirmation. Thomas nodded. "Yes." Samuel looked at the herd of cattle, counting them by eye, an old habit of someone who used to own a whole farm. His gaze stopped at the empty space where 6 cows had disappeared. "Blackwell," Samuel said without asking. Thomas didn't answer. "No need." Samuel took off his hat, placed it on his chest for a moment as a gesture of reverence for something lost. Then he looked up, gazing directly at Thomas. "He thought time was on his side," Samuel said. "He always thought so." Evelyn took half a step forward. "But not everyone forgets." Samuel turned to her, his gaze softening. "Yes, not everyone forgets." He gestured toward the low wooden house behind the trees. "Wait a moment." Samuel turned and walked away, slowly but surely. Thomas watched him without asking. He knew people like Samuel. They didn't talk much, but when they did, their words carried weight. A few minutes later, Samuel returned with a young man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his eyes, though still youthful, were not naive. His boots were dusty, and the reins were neatly coiled in his hand. "This is Miguel," Samuel said. "My son." Miguel nodded in greeting. "I heard you've been away for a while." Thomas looked at Samuel, gradually understanding. "You don't need," Samuel waved his hand, interrupting but not rudely. "I need it," he said. "I've been waiting for an opportunity like this." He spoke very slowly, as if reopening an old memory. Years ago, Samuel's land lay beside a small stream, not large but enough to feed the livestock through the dry season. Blackwell came. The initial offer sounded kind. Then the interest increased. Then the paperwork grew thicker. Then a dry season arrived earlier than expected. Finally, Samuel signed, not because he lost the argument, but because he was exhausted. "I thought I had lost," Samuel said, "but then I realized I was just being pushed forward." He looked at Thomas. "You're being pushed around." Thomas was silent. Evelyn looked at Samuel, then at Miguel. She saw in the eyes of the father and son a thread connecting the past and the present, the thread of those who had once bowed their heads but never forgotten. "I have no land to give," Samuel continued, "but I have young hands." And an old memory. Miguel stepped forward without hesitation. "I can lead the cows across the pass," he said. "I know the way." Thomas looked at Evelyn. She nodded slightly, not out of complete reassurance, but because she understood the value of this companionship. It didn't come from pity. It came from a shared recognition of an injustice. "We can't afford to pay much," Thomas said. Samuel smiled, a thin but warm smile. "It's not work. It's remembering." They walked together as the sun rose higher. Miguel went ahead, guiding the cattle through the narrow path to avoid rock slides. He worked neatly and spoke little. Samuel followed a short distance behind, slowly but steadily. He didn't rush. He didn't give unnecessary instructions. He knew when to be silent and let others proceed on their own. On the way, Samuel told Thomas about other people, names no longer on the land map but still in the memory of this region. Those forced to sell prematurely, those who lost their cattle overnight, those who left without looking back because looking back would only cause more pain. "We haven't forgotten," Samuel said. "We're just waiting." Evelyn listened, her heart sinking. She realized their pain wasn't isolated. It was a silent current accumulating over the years. And when someone dared to stand tall, that current found its way out. At midday, they rested by the shallow bank. Miguel divided the water and checked the oxen's hooves. Samuel sat on a rock, gazing into the distance. Thomas ate little but drank enough. Evelyn took quick notes, marking the difficult sections of the trail. "You are not alone," Samuel said, as if making it an undeniable conclusion. Thomas looked at him, then at Miguel. "Thank you," he said. Just 2 words, but enough. In the afternoon, the wind changed direction. Clouds gathered, obscuring the sun. The road ahead became rougher. Miguel walked close to the herd of cattle, maintaining the rhythm. Samuel lagged slightly behind, but didn't leave the formation. He understood the value of staying in his place. When a cow slipped, Miguel reacted quickly, pulling it up in time. Evelyn assisted, retying the rope. Thomas saw the understanding forming without commands. Those who had been oppressed knew how to support each other at the right moment. Late in the afternoon, they stopped to rest. Samuel stood beside Thomas, gazing towards the distant, hazy red hollow. "Blackwell won't stop," Samuel said. "But he's not used to being stared at directly." Thomas nodded. "We're not turning back." Samuel smiled. "I know." At night, they lit a small fire. Unpretentious, just warm enough. Samuel told old stories without embellishment. Miguel listened occasionally, adding a detail. Evelyn realized there was an unspoken agreement between them to tell the truth, but not to complain. When the fire died down, Samuel stood up. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said. "Miguel will go with you." Thomas instinctively objected. Samuel waved his hand. "There are things that young people need to do, and there are things that old people need to hold the place of memory for." Evelyn looked at Samuel, a quiet respect welling up inside her. "You've stood up properly," she said. Samuel nodded. "Just the right time is enough." The next morning, Samuel left before dawn. Miguel stayed behind. The cattle continued rolling toward Clearwater Junction. Thomas felt his steps become more steady, not because he was less afraid, but because he knew he was walking alongside people who understood the price of humility. Along that path, the men who remember chose to stand up, not with gunfire, but with their presence. And sometimes that was enough to tip the scales of a town that seemed to be under their control. But just as solidarity began to form, the path ahead began to descend into darkness, where a small noise in the night could shatter all plans and test courage to the very limit. Night falls quickly in the mountains of western Wyoming. There was no glorious sunset, just a fading light, then it vanished as if someone had blown out a lamp. The space around them closed in deep and cold. Dark mountains rose steeply, obscuring the starry sky. They pitched their camp in a narrow valley where the wind was less strong. The fire was lit low, just enough to provide warmth and boil water, but not enough to be seen from afar. Miguel tied the cattle in a circle, a habit of someone who had spent many nights outdoors. Thomas checked the ropes more carefully than usual. Evelyn stood beside him, her hand holding a notebook, but her eyes never left the darkness outside. No one talks about the worry, but everyone carries it with them. When the fire was reduced to embers, they huddled closer together. Miguel told a few short stories without laughing loudly, just to keep the silence from becoming too heavy. Thomas listened with half an ear. He gazed into the shadows where the dark tree trunks stacked like an invisible fence. "It's quiet tonight," Miguel said. Thomas didn't answer. He'd lived long enough to know that some quiet nights weren't a good sign. They took turns watching. Miguel took the first shift. Thomas lay down but didn't sleep. Evelyn closed her eyes, but her breathing was shallow. Old memories, the auction room, the laughter, the silence still lingered, waiting for a sound to resurface. Then it arrived. A dry, sharp explosion echoed from the northern slope of the mountain. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't the sound of a rock slide. Gunshots. The sound ripped through the night, echoing into the valley, bouncing back from the cliffs, multiplying exponentially. Immediately afterward, another sound, lower, closer. Miguel shouted something in Spanish and charged towards the herd of cattle. Panic erupted. The cattle bellowed, tugged at their reins, and trampled over each other in blind terror. One slipped and fell heavily to the ground. A short bellow, then silence. Thomas sprang to his feet, his heart pounding. He grabbed the lamp and ran toward the makeshift stable. Evelyn followed without even having time to put on another coat. Gunshots rang out again, this time fired straight down at the ground near the herd of cattle. Dust and rocks flew everywhere. Not aimed at people. Not intended for direct killing. It's just meant to sow fear. "Everyone lie down," Thomas shouted. Miguel tried to hold back the cattle, but the ropes were pulled taut. One snapped. Two of the cows dashed into the darkness, disappearing among the trees. Evelyn froze when she saw the cow lie motionless. Blood seeped into the ground, dark and black under the flickering lamplight. "Oh my God," she whispered. The gunfire stopped abruptly as it had begun. No laughter, no talking, only the gasping breaths of cattle, the pounding of human hearts, and the lingering smell of gunpowder in the cold air. Thomas stood amidst the chaos, breathing heavily. He looked around, no one was there. Only the mountains, the trees, and the shadows that knew how to hide themselves. Miguel turned around, his face pale. "I didn't see them. I don't know where they are." Thomas nodded. He didn't need to know either. The message has been sent. They worked in silence for the rest of the night, retying the ropes, herding the remaining cattle closer together. Miguel went to look for the two missing cows, but returned empty-handed. One was dead. The other two had vanished. 3 babies in one night. Evelyn sat down beside the dead cow, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't cry. But something in her eyes sank, not hope, but a deep, bone-chilling weariness. Thomas stood a few steps away. He looked at the carcass, the broken rope, the empty space where the 2 oxen had run off. He didn't need to do any calculations to know what this meant. He knows. This is the end. It's not because of a lost cow. It's not because of a lost money, but because they were found, and the other one showed them that nowhere is far enough. Thomas sat down on the ground, his back against a cold rock. He took off his hat and placed it on his knees. His shoulders slumped as if he had just laid down an enormous burden and didn't know if he had the strength to stand up again. "This is the end," he said very softly. Evelyn heard him. She turned to look at him. In that moment she saw Thomas no longer the strong man he once was, but a man who had reached the very limit of his endurance. Miguel stood nearby, feeling awkward. He was young, but old enough to understand that this wasn't just vandalism. This was a warning. "I'm sorry," Miguel said. Thomas shook his head. "It's not my fault." He looked up at the obscured sky. No stars, no moon, just a thick dark black. He thought of Samuel Ortega. He thought of those who had walked this path and turned back. He thought of Caldwell, of the leaning wooden house. Perhaps Blackwell was right. Perhaps honor truly doesn't feed cattle. Perhaps all they did was prolong the inevitable. Evelyn walked over and sat down next to Thomas. No hug, no empty words of comfort. She placed her hand on the ground where it was still warm from the cow's recent fall. "Look," she said, her voice very low. "They're not shooting at us." Thomas turned around. "They didn't want to kill him," Evelyn continued. "They wanted him to believe he had lost." Thomas didn't reply, but the words took root somewhere within him like a tiny seed falling on barren land. It was nearly dawn. A cold mist settled over the valley. The remaining cattle, weary, huddled together. Miguel rekindled the fire, making it small and low. Thomas slowly rose to his feet. He looked back at the cattle, at Evelyn, and at Miguel. If this is the end, it's a bitter one. But if this is just the deepest point, then perhaps there's still a way forward. But at this moment he couldn't see it. He only knew that everything they had tried to hold on to had been pushed to the brink. And as the first rays of dawn appeared between those cold mountains, Evelyn understood that if they wanted to preserve anything after this night of gunfire, they would have to choose again, not between land and money, but between land and people. The dawn after a night of gunfire brought no relief. The faint light shone down on the valley like a chilling reminder that everything remained. The carcass of the ox dragged aside, the panicked footprints etched in the ground, and the heavy silence among the survivors. Thomas Caldwell sat alone on the rock since last night, his back straight but his shoulders heavy. He looked at the remaining herd of oxen, fewer in number, more despondent, much like his own faith now. Evelyn stood a few steps away from him. She didn't approach immediately. She understood that there are moments when a man needs to be alone to confront what he fears losing most. Miguel rekindled the fire and boiled water. He worked quietly, occasionally glancing at Thomas before turning away. Youth helped him recover more quickly from panic, but it didn't help him fully understand the weight of memories tied to the land, something only those who have lived long enough can truly grasp. Evelyn only approached when the water was boiling. "We need to talk," she said, her voice calm but firm. Thomas didn't look up. "If it's about going back," he said, "then no." Evelyn sat down opposite him on the cold ground. "No need to go back." He looked up then. His eyes were tired and defensive. "So what is it?" Evelyn took a deep breath. She knew that what she was about to say would touch the hardest part of Thomas, the part forged by years of loss. "We need to sell some of the land," she said. The words fell into the valley like a stone. Thomas jumped up immediately. "No," he said, his voice sharp and higher than usual. "Never." Miguel flinched. He stepped back a few paces as if avoiding a strong gust of wind. "That's my land," Thomas continued. "It's all I have. I've lost enough already." Evelyn didn't get up. She looked up at him without avoiding his gaze. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm saying this." Thomas took a few steps, then turned back like a cornered animal. "You don't understand," he said. "That piece of land is why I stand here. It's where my wife is buried. It's where I believed I still had someone." Evelyn felt her heart tighten, but she didn't back down. "I know more than you think." "No," Thomas interrupted. "You can't understand. You didn't grow up here. You don't. But I'm here," Evelyn said, her voice lowering. "And I'm going through this with you." A tense silence ensued. The wind swept through the valley, carrying the scent of damp earth and old gunpowder. Thomas gasped for breath. He looked down at the ground as if seeing his entire life unfold before him. Each harvest, each hedge, each tiny hope placed in that piece of land. Selling even a portion of it would feel like cutting off a part of his own body. "Selling the land," he said slowly, his voice heavy as a loss. Evelyn shook her head. "No. Losing him is the real loss." That statement made Thomas stop in his tracks. "You've seen it," Evelyn continued, her voice softer but no less firm. "They don't want the land immediately. They want you exhausted. They want you to stay and be drained." Thomas remained silent. "We're selling a portion," Evelyn said. "Not the part with the main water source. Not the soul of the farm. Just enough to keep us going, enough to protect the rest." Thomas turned away. He gazed toward the horizon where mountains stretched, endlessly motionless. He remembered last night when he believed it was all over. He remembered the feeling of helplessness when the gunshots rang out, when the cattle panicked, when Evelyn stood there, small but unyielding. "She wants me to give up," he said, his voice low. Evelyn stood up at that moment. She stepped closer, not touching, but close enough for Thomas to feel her presence. "No," she said. "I want you to choose." Thomas turned to look at her. In his eyes, the anger had subsided, giving way to something deeper, a fear of losing the meaning of a lifetime. "If I sell," he said, "who will I be?" Evelyn looked him straight in the eye. "You'll be the one who keeps those who come with you." The answer wasn't flowery, but it hit the mark. Thomas glanced at Miguel. He was sitting by the fire, a cup of water in his hand, his eyes following them. Then he thought of Samuel Ortega, a man who had lost his land but retained his memory, his dignity. He thought of the night Evelyn collapsed, of the confession about the $2, of how she had stayed after everything. "We hold onto the land but lose our people." That thought was clear and chilling. He recalled the years before when his wife was still alive, when this land was not just property but a place filled with laughter and anticipation. If today he were to hold onto the land at all costs, but lose Evelyn, the woman who stood by him when he hit rock bottom? What meaning would that land have? Thomas sat down very slowly. He raised his hand to his face, covering his eyes for a moment. When he lowered his hand, his gaze was different, not less painful, but brighter. "I was wrong," he said very softly. "I thought holding on to the land meant holding on to everything." Evelyn said nothing. She waited. But to hold on to the land while losing the people, Thomas continued, that would be the real failure. Miguel heard that. He turned away as if respecting the moment of privacy. Thomas let out a long sigh, as if a heavy burden he had carried for years had been lifted. "We'll sell a portion," he said. "As you said." Evelyn nodded. She didn't smile. She knew this wasn't a victory. This was growing up something that always comes with loss. "Thank you," she said. Thomas shook his head. "No, thank you for not leaving." They stood there in the valley, still smelling of gunpowder among the weary but surviving cattle. There were no promises of the future. But one thing was rightly stated: people are more important than any piece of land if that land is left without people to stand on it. The wind changed direction. The clouds dispersed. Brighter sunlight shone down on the road leading to Clearwater Junction. Thomas looked ahead. He didn't know how it would all end, but he knew that from this moment on he was no longer bound by an old definition of winning and losing. He chose the person. And it is from this seemingly fatal choice, when land is no longer the sole center, that the path ahead begins to open up, where raging currents and fragile opportunities await their final test. The river appeared on Tuesday morning, the night after the gunfire. Not wide, but the water flowed swiftly due to melting snow from the northern mountains. The murky gray water swirled, carrying broken branches and white foam. Miguel stopped first, observing carefully. He threw a stone down, watching how quickly the water swept away. "We have to get through," he said. "There's no detour." Thomas stood on the bank, his hand gripping the reins tightly. The rest of the cattle huddled behind him, weary but still following. Evelyn stood beside him, her coat fastened, her hair neatly tied back. No one voiced their anxiety, but everyone understood if they could cross this river they had a chance. If not, everything could end here. Miguel went in first. The water came up to his knees, then his waist. He held on tight to the rope, signaling to Thomas. "Go at them one by one." Thomas nodded. He led the first cow down. The cold water cut into their legs harder than expected. The cow stumbled, but Thomas held on. Evelyn stood on the bank, ready to assist, her eyes fixed on his every move. The second child, then the third. One of them slipped, and the water rose almost to its neck. Evelyn screamed. Miguel rushed over and pulled the rope. Thomas put all his strength into it, the slippery mud nearly causing him to fall. But they held on. The cow crossed to the other side of the bank, panting heavily, and stood firm. One by one they led the herd of cows across the river. Not fast, not graceful, but persistent. When the last cow set foot on the bank, all three stood silently for a long time, no cheers, no embraces. Just a sigh, like people who had just crossed a boundary, unsure of their strength. Evelyn sat down on a rock, her hands trembling slightly. Thomas offered her water. She took a small sip, then looked up at him. "We're past it." Thomas nodded. "Yes, there are no other words to be said." Clearwater Junction appeared late that afternoon. Not large, not flashy. Just a new railroad junction, a few warehouses, a few small shops, and an atmosphere different from Red Hollow, not owned by one person. News of the cattle arrived faster than they expected. A trader from the east came to see them. He looked at the cattle, asked a few questions, and didn't haggle over the price. Thomas answered briefly and truthfully. Evelyn stood beside him, listening to each number. The bargaining was quiet. No big win, but fair. When the money was placed on the table, Thomas looked at the neatly arranged coins. Not much. Not enough to get rich. But enough to breathe. Enough to pay off urgent debts. Enough to keep the remaining land. Enough to avoid returning to Red Hollow with your head bowed. Miguel smiled for the first time since the night the shots rang out. "Samuel will be happy," he said. Thomas nodded. "Go tell him. We're standing now." Miguel left the following morning. Not many words of farewell. Just a firm handshake, a knowing glance. People like them didn't need lengthy promises. Thomas and Evelyn stayed at Clearwater Junction for another night. They slept well, dreamless but deep sleep. When they woke up, sunlight streamed through the wooden window, warmer than in Red Hollow. On the way back to Caldwell Farm, Everything looked different, not because the land had changed, but because they had changed. The leaning log cabin was still there. The cowshed was even emptier than before. But Thomas no longer saw them as evidence of failure. He saw them as the rest of his life, imperfect but still within his grasp. They sold a portion of the land just as they said. Not the soul, just enough to continue. Blackwell wasn't happy. But this time he no longer had the complete freedom to wait. Some of the paperwork was no longer in his possession. Thomas wasn't rich. He didn't win outright. But he stood tall. In the evening they sat on the porch watching the sunset over the prairie. A gentle breeze blew. The smell of gunpowder was gone. Only the scent of grass and earth remained. Evelyn was knitting gloves again. Thomas was mending a piece of wood. No one talked about the distant future. Only about tomorrow, things to do, the fence to patch, the cows to care for. Thomas looked at Evelyn for a long time. "You know," he said, his voice low and slow, as if recounting an old memory, "those $2. I thought it was the most shameful thing that had ever happened to me." Evelyn didn't look up. And now Thomas smiled faintly. "Now I think that was the kindest thing I've ever done." Evelyn stopped what she was doing and looked at him. She didn't smile. But there was a gentle, enduring light in her eyes. "They don't call it love. It doesn't need to. It's something that transcends the meaning of a name. Night falls, the stars rise. Wyoming stretches as far as the eye can see, as if there had never been an auction, never been gunfire, never two undervalued individuals had risen to prominence. But they know. And that's enough. $2 don't buy a wife. They buy an opportunity. And a reason to get back on your feet again." And years later, when asked what Thomas Caldwell had bought on the darkest night of his life, he simply looked toward the porch where Evelyn still sat and replied, "Not what I possess, but what I haven't lost." The story, "The Cowboy Paid $2 for the Girl No One Wanted and Found His Only Hope," doesn't teach us how to get rich, nor does it promise a perfect ending. But it leaves us with very real lessons, especially for those who have passed the latter half of their lives. The first lesson is, a person's worth is never determined by the number others put on you. Evelyn Crow was once valued at $2. But that says nothing about her worth. It only reflects the shallowness of the world around her. In modern life, many people have also been similarly undervalued because of age, failure, or circumstances. The story reminds us, don't let others decide how much you're worth. Lesson 2. Honor isn't what gets you big wins, but it helps you avoid losing to yourself. Thomas Caldwell didn't win big. He wasn't rich. But he kept his land, his dignity, and most importantly, his companion. At any age, there are things that once lost can never be replaced. And finally, the deepest love doesn't begin with promises, but with presence. No one saves anyone. They simply choose not to leave. And sometimes that's the miracle. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you find these values still relevant in today's life, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling slow, humane stories for hearts that have been hurt but have never stopped believing. See you in the next story.